Hey, welcome back to 9.1 Part 2. The last part of this introductory section reminds us that we are making conclusions based on a single sample. A different day, a different sample, and we may come to a different conclusion. This is the nature of statistics and why we must always be completely transparent about how we collect our samples and how we do our calculations. Even if we do everything perfectly, it could be that we just got a crazy sample and we happen to draw an incorrect conclusion based on that sample. We might reject H0, the null, when we shouldn't, or we might fail to reject the null when we should. All right, those are the only two things we get to do, reject the null or fail to reject the null. So these are two different issues, and they get two different names. A type 1 error occurs when we incorrectly reject the null based on our sample. And a type 2 error occurs when we incorrectly fail to reject the null. All right, so those are things probably you want to put on your note card. They're very, very specific, and that's what we're going to explore with some examples. So page 420, number 28, A and B. Okay. Washers used in a certain application are supposed to have a thickness of 2 millimeters. A quality control engineer measures the thickness of a sample of washers and tests the null hypothesis that the mean really is 2 versus the alternative that the mean is not equal to 2. So if a type 1 error is made, what conclusion will be drawn regarding the mean washer thickness? Okay. Look back at it. If the type 1 error is made, that means we rejected the null when we were not supposed to. Oops, spell that right. So type 1 error only occurs if we incorrectly reject H0. So that means the conclusion that we would have made, let me write out the hypotheses. So null is that the mean is 2. The alternative is that the mean is not 2, right? And if we made a type 1 error, then we decided to reject the null based on our sample. So we would incorrectly conclude that the mean thickness is not 2 millimeters. And what we maybe know, maybe don't know, is that that was wrong. In fact, the machines were working fine. The thickness really is 2, like it's supposed to be, but our sample made us reject that, and we conclude that the mean thickness is not 2 millimeters, and that's a type 1 error. So if we make a type 2 error, that's when we fail to reject H0, even though we should have rejected. Again, we don't know what we're supposed to do, but this is what can happen. So once again, if the null is that the mean is 2, the alternative is that the mean is not 2, and this time we fail to reject the null, that means we conclude that the mean really is 2. We conclude the mean thickness is 2 millimeters. So those are we make the two conclusions, and you can kind of see that they have different levels of importance depending on the situation. So if we conclude that the mean thickness is not 2 millimeters when it really was, we're just going to make somebody go in and start adjusting the machine. It was working fine, and the person's going to try to adjust it and say, hey, this machine is already working fine, you're wasting my time. Not too bad, right? Now look at the other situation. If we conclude that the mean thickness is 2 millimeters, but the machine is actually malfunctioning, we say, hey, there's nothing wrong with this machine, and nobody goes to fix it, and the machine continues to make improper washers until the next sample is taken, until the problem is fixed. So it's two different kinds of things that can go wrong, and it does just depend on what conclusion was drawn. And again, in the real world, we don't really necessarily know if there was a mistake or not. we would just have to take another sample and compare the results and see if there's consistency. Okay, so we're also going to look, this is a subtle thing. So here's a couple more examples looking at this with some of the check your understanding problems. So let's work through these. Yeah, we have a couple. So number 4, page 419, a test is made of the null hypothesis that the mean is 100 versus the alternative, the mean is not 100. The true value of the mean is 150, and based on the sample, H0 is rejected. Is this a type 1 error, a type 2 error, or a correct decision? So the way I look at this is that the true value is 150. So we should have rejected the null. The null is, the mean is not 100. The mean is 150. We should have rejected the null, and we did. So there's been no error. So that just takes some thinking about, and this is a very subtle thing that happens, and it'll make sense and then it won't make sense. So just let these things percolate. Let's look at the next example. Number 5, a test is made of null hypothesis mean equal to 18 versus the alternative mean greater than 18. The true value of the mean is 20, and the null was not rejected. All right, so I didn't write out the last one, but this one might be more useful to write out those hypotheses. The mean equal to 18 versus the mean greater than 18. All right, so if the mean really is 20, we should be down here, right? 20 is greater than 18. So we should have gotten a sample that said reject the null, right? Our sample should have made us reject the null, but look at this, we did not reject the null. That's an error. Then we just have to figure out which type. So let me write some of that down. So again, we should have rejected the null and said that the mean was greater than 20. We failed to reject the null. That's what we're told. So that's definitely an error. And when you incorrectly fail to reject the null, that is a type 2 error. So when you fail to reject the null, that's a type 2 error. Okay, let's try one more. I know these are kind of tough. So now we have a test made of the null hypothesis that the mean is equal to 3, alternative that the mean is less than 3. So the true value of the mean is 3, and we reject the null. All right, so the true value of the mean is 3. That's the null statement. The null is that the mean is 3. So we should not have rejected the null in this case. The true value is 3. We should not have rejected the null, and we did. Again, we should not have rejected the null, but we did based on our sample. So that's an error, and we just have to think it through. What kind of an error? If you reject the null, that's a type 1 error. If you reject the null and you were not supposed to, that's a type 1 error. So those are the things that can happen. There is no error, a type 1 error, or a type 2 error. And in the real world, as I say down here, we usually do not have the true value, so we don't even get to know if an error was made or not. And I've made a big deal about these errors, but as I say here, they are not a big part of the exam, maybe 2 questions on it, kind of a thing. So work on it, but the rest of the hypothesis test stuff, those 5 steps, that's going to be much more important. All right, that's it.